I'm Talia, I make things and this is where I post videos about them. Sometimes. I would like to be better about that this year. I sort of posted a few last year and then disappeared, but I'm back now and I would like to post more this year. I'm going to start off with a nice relaxed video. I'd like to just sit and chat and knit with you guys, and yeah, I'm going to be talking about something that's a bit topical. I say a bit topical because it is the end of January and I know that it feels kind of late to be setting any goals or knitting intentions or resolutions for the new year, but it is still kind of the beginning of the year, so I think we can get away with it. And anyway, I'm not going to be setting any goals or resolutions in this video. I'm going to be talking about why I'm not. So if you'd like to hear more about that, then stick around, grab some knitting, and yeah, let's chat. So firstly, let's talk about what I am working on. It doesn't look like much yet, but this is going to be the pattern is called The Cute Top by Laka Baga. It's in her new book. It's not that new anymore, but I got it towards the end of last year and I have been unable to stop knitting the patterns from that book. They are so good and so wonderful. I highly recommend it. It's the English translation is titled Close Knit. I have the German translation because if you know anything about Laka Baga's book and so on, you'll know that the English translation is the only one that doesn't have a pink cover with the green script. I wanted the pink cover with the green script, so I got the German version because I can speak German. It's not very well, but yeah, well enough to be able to read a knitting book and enjoy it and make the patterns from it. So yeah, I'm knitting it in 2 different strands. So there's like a darker turquoise strand and a cobalt blue strand. And yeah, I really like how the marling is working out. It doesn't show so well on the camera, but trust me, it looks pretty nice in person. Also, I am sitting in front of another Laka Baga pattern, which is the Bad Idea blanket. This is an ongoing project that I have made out of all sorts of scraps, and I actually started this before I got the book, and just based on the posts that I've seen, images of the blanket, so I decided I would just start making one. And yeah, here it is. If you can see back there, it doesn't cover the whole bed yet, but we're gonna get there eventually. The point of this, especially for me, is to have something that's kind of mindless. It's like a really excellent travel project, which you will know if you follow me on Instagram. I post a lot of pictures of me working on this in planes and cars and all sorts of things. So let's get into it. So it's the beginning of the year and I keep seeing people posting about their knitting resolutions. Some of them are really specific, so you'll have people saying that they want to reduce their yarn stash by a certain amount, they want to knit a certain amount of projects, they want to learn specific new techniques. Others have been a little bit more vague about it, or abstract rather. Vague sounds negative and I don't mean this in a negative way at all. So people have a more abstract kind of intentions. I'm going to be referring to resolutions, goals and intentions as kind of, I'm going to be using those interchangeably throughout this video. In my mind, that's kind of, for the purposes of what I'm talking about here, those are the same thing. So in terms of abstract goals and intentions. People have been saying that they want to be more intentional about what yarn they buy, about what projects they choose to knit, and that kind of thing. So seeing all this content made me want to consider what I want to set as my resolution or goals and intentions and so on for this year. And I kind of went down a bit of a spiral. I was thinking for quite a long, over a few days, weeks, as this kind of content was starting to crop up a bit more, I was thinking, what do I want to do this year? How do I want to approach my knitting this year? And honestly, it was making me quite stressed, which is the opposite of what I want my knitting to be for me. So I knit to de-stress, and nobody's forcing me to do it. I'm not even forcing myself to do it. If there is an evening when I decide, okay, I don't feel like knitting this evening, then I don't, it's not something I force myself to do, and nobody's forcing me to do it in a certain way either. I also don't force myself to do it in a certain way, and I like it that way. I really do. And the moment I started thinking about it that way, and I was thinking, you know what, maybe I shouldn't set myself any resolutions or goals or intentions for this year, I immediately felt less stressed, which is, like I said, how I want to feel about knitting. I don't think there's anything wrong with setting resolutions, goals, intentions, that kind of thing. I do that for other areas of my life, not formally necessarily, or I'm not one of those people who has lists and lists and lists of goals, but I do have ideas of what I'd like to achieve. I also have set myself a New Year's resolution this year, which is to basically get dressed or dress up, because last year I started working from home. I moved to a city where I spend a lot less time in public because it's not a walkable city like where I used to live. And also the public here, the people in the city dress much more casually than where I used to live. I used to live in a student town, and if any of you have done that, have lived in a student town or visited a student town, well, I don't know if it's this way everywhere else, but especially because most schools in South Africa, where I live, where I'm from, that explains the accent. So most schools in South Africa have a uniform, and because of that, I find that people like to express themselves through their clothes once they hit university. So there's a lot more experimentation happening in terms of, also just in generally in terms of looks, because we can suddenly wear makeup, and boys can grow their hair and their facial hair and their head hair, which many of them do. So yeah, basically just to say that in student towns it's definitely more common to see people dressing up a bit more, especially the students themselves. So that's where I used to live, and I don't live there anymore, and I found that last year I kind of stopped getting dressed, and it affected my mood, it affected my productivity, I'm sure, and it just makes me happy to get dressed. And it is effort, so that's why I kind of got lax about it last year, but this year I'm going to be a little bit more intentional. I've started doing that, definitely, and it has worked wonders for my mood. So yeah, all of that to say that I don't think there's anything wrong with New Year's resolutions, and they can bring you a lot of joy. And I've seen that be the case for many of the people who have been posting about their knitting intentions and their goals and their resolutions. They're excited to tackle new challenges, or to have a little bit more structure in their knitting. And for many people it is going to make their knitting more manageable, less overwhelming, and more fulfilling. I know, going back to my New Year's resolution of getting dressed, I know that getting dressed every day will improve my mood, and it just improves my life, makes my life a bit more fun and a bit more manageable and a bit more fulfilling. For my knitting, on the other hand, I think that making rules for myself won't bring me any joy. And I've come up with a few reasons why I think this, and yeah, I'm gonna get into those now. So firstly, I cannot predict what will serve me in terms of knitting and yarn behavior throughout this year. And if I try to, and if I make those goals, it can go one of three ways. So firstly, I predict it correctly. I love it, it fuels me, I'm making things that I love, it makes me sleep better at night, it makes me want to knit all the time, and that's great. The second option is that I would have predicted incorrectly about what will serve me, and I push through anyway. So I end up working on a project or a technique that no longer serves me, no longer brings me joy, but I continue to work on it because I said I would, and that's the only reason. Just because I decided months ago that I would do something, I just do it, and there's no other reason why I would be working on it. And thirdly, I predicted incorrectly and I fail. I don't do it. I predicted that it would serve me to work on a certain project or a certain technique, and I decide I don't want to do it anymore, and I don't end up pushing through and doing it. I let myself work on things that bring me joy, which is great, but in this scenario I would just have this like horrible lingering feeling of failure, which none of us like. And yeah, I think, like many people, I really don't like the feeling of failure. I think it's a broader cultural problem to have this aversion to failure, even though failure can be a wonderful opportunity for growth. I think culturally we don't approach that in the way that we should. But yeah, I just know that it affects me very deeply to feel that I'm failing at something. I personally would love an area in my life where I simply cannot fail. I cannot fail at knitting. And that is what knitting has been for me. In certain circumstances, it has made me feel like a failure if I don't manage to do something or do a technique correctly or whatever. But that was generally because I set myself a goal, I told myself I was going to do something, I pushed through, and I either pushed through and didn't get it right, or I stopped doing it and I felt failure. So I'd like to keep knitting as my thing where I literally cannot fail. Of these three options that I've mentioned, the only desirable option is number one, which is the one where I predicted correctly and I told myself I was going to knit something, and then I do, and I end up loving it. And I end up loving it. But I don't need to make that prediction to knit the thing that I love, if that makes sense. So I can still knit things that I love without having predicted that I will love them months ago, if that makes sense. Which essentially would be like making a resolution about doing something or trying something and then ending up loving it, you know? So the second reason why I'm not making any knitting resolutions this year is that when you make a resolution, again, you are predicting what will serve you. And many of my favorite projects have been unplanned impulse cast-ons. So many of them. Most of them, actually. Most of the favorite things that I've made and that I wear have been unplanned. I don't want to miss out on knitting playtime, or, you know, just basically digging into my stash and making something out of something, some fibre there that has inspired me. I don't want to miss out on knitting something that ignites a fire in me and makes me want to knit late into the night. I don't want to miss out on that because I told myself I was going to be doing something else. I want to feed that fire when it's there, because that's how many of my favorite projects have been born, and that's what keeps me going with knitting. I am afraid that if I make too many rules for my knitting, that it will kill my love for knitting. There's something just so magical about a project or technique or a way of thinking that comes into your life spontaneously at exactly the right time. And I would like to approach my knitting that way. I believe this about certain types of media and fiction and so on. If something comes into your life at the right time, it can be so special. There are people who have certain emotional connections, or certain types of connections with pieces of media that they consumed at the right time in their lives. And I know this is getting very deep, but yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've ever experienced this with something where you maybe watch a movie when you're younger and it doesn't have much of an effect on you, and then you watch it a bit later at a certain time in your life when you're feeling a certain way, or you're doing a certain thing, you're in a different stage of your life, and suddenly that piece of media just has a way more profound effect on you. I like to think that way about knitting as well. I don't know if this is too deep. Am I thinking too much? Probably. But I like that idea. I like the idea that I am excited to do something because it's the right thing for me at that time, and I don't want to miss out on that because I've decided at the beginning of the year how I'm gonna knit. So my third and final reason why I'm not making any knitting resolutions is that I'm happy with how I knit and how I consume yarn. When I was thinking about possible resolutions for myself, I was going through a bunch of really common ones, the things that I've been seeing popping up all over social media, and one by one I realized they didn't really apply to me. So for example, many people are doing yarn no-buys, or they're only working with yarn from their stash, or actively trying to de-stash yarn, that kind of thing. And my stash is not the smallest, but it works for me the way it is. I work mainly with scrap yarns, so it makes sense for me to have a stash that's of a certain size, because if I didn't, I wouldn't have enough yarn to complete any projects. I wouldn't have enough of a variety of yarns to make something as interesting and colourful, not necessarily colourful, but as interesting and tactile as I want it to be. And also, it doesn't burden me, my stash. So for a lot of people it takes up to a lot of space. It ends up costing people more money than they would like. But my stash personally is not a financial burden on me. Like I said, I work with scrap yarns. I buy most of my yarns secondhand. They don't cost a lot. And I also have enough space. So I don't live in a tiny space, and it's just me and my partner in a in a 2-bedroom townhouse, and we have enough space. So could my stash technically be smaller? Yes, but at this point it doesn't burden me, and it also just brings me joy to look at all the different colors and the textures and so on. So I'm not going to put pressure on myself to use or to get rid of any yarns that I don't feel are serving me at this time. You know, there's a time and a place for all my yarns, and I'm going to use them as I am inspired to. So another common resolution is that many people want to move away from using acrylic and want to use only natural fibers. If you've seen my unpopular knitting opinions video, then you'll know how I feel about that. I like using all different types of fibers, but I mainly use acrylic for various reasons. It's easier to care for than most natural fibers. It is not itchy like wool. It is what's available to me in the secondhand shops where I buy most of my yarn. I just like it. So I'm going to keep using it, and so it doesn't serve me at all to try and work only with natural fibers. Another resolution that people have been making for themselves is to be more intentional about knitting things that they will get a lot of use out of. I have enough thoughts about this to fill an entire 3-hour long video, but in short, I would love to be one of those people who can knit like petite knit, or my favorite things, knitwear. I'd love to be able to be one of those people who can make it all the way through an entire sweater in white or beige, because that is what I'm likely to wear. So I know that if I knit something, a beautiful basic white sweater, I will get a lot of wear out of it. That is what I'm most likely to get the most amount of wear out of. However, I have had to accept that I'm simply not that person. I am more like Lekker Bagger or the Knit Edit. I am incapable of knitting a large monochrome piece. I live for bright, colourful statement knits, and I love knitting those things, but it isn't necessarily what I'm going to be wearing every day. I have knit things that have brought me a lot of joy to knit and bring me a lot of joy to wear, but I find that those projects aren't necessarily as common as projects that just bring me a lot of joy to knit. And that's okay. One of my favorite things about knitting is that you can just unravel it and you have more or less the same amount of yarn that you had when you started. There might be a little bit that you have to snip off in terms of knots and so on, but you more or less have the same amount of yarn that you started off with, and you can knit it again. I've become quite comfortable with unraveling things that aren't working in my wardrobe, and I would rather just do that. I'd rather knit things that bring me joy to knit and unravel them and knit that yarn again until eventually maybe it becomes something that I will wear a lot. That is how I prefer to approach my knitting rather than trying to force myself to knit something I don't like knitting just because I'll get a lot of wear out of it. So I think I'm going to make a full video about that. Let me know if you want to watch that. I will probably make it anyway, but yeah, let me know. So those are all the reasons why I'm not making any knitting resolutions, goals or intentions for myself this year. You could argue that there are some resolutions hiding in there, like I could say I want to knit things that bring me joy. I can say that I want to unravel things that I'm no longer wearing or whatever. But a resolution implies that you want to change something about the way you are behaving or approaching something. And yeah, basically you want to do things differently. And I wouldn't say that any of the things that I've mentioned imply that I want to do anything differently. I don't think I need to change anything about the way that I approach my knitting. I'm not saying that the way that I approach knitting hasn't changed ever and will not continue to change, but I would prefer it to be a bit more organic, and it doesn't feel natural to me right now to make any resolutions that will inspire change. So yeah, it's just a lot more freeing for me to think of this as I don't have any knitting resolutions. I can knit whatever I want. I can buy whatever yarn I want, because I find that I don't want to change anything. So all of this being said, I do have one knitting related thing that I would like to do this year, and that is basically that I want to share more of what I knit. There are a lot of knitting and craft related thoughts living rent-free in my brain, and it would be nice to have a place to let them out and let them mix with whatever thoughts are living rent-free in your brain. And yeah, so speaking of which, I would love to know what you think about these thoughts that I have on knitting resolutions. How do you feel about New Year's resolutions in general? Do you have any goals, intentions or resolutions for your knitting? Please let me know. And let me know if you have any non-knitting related resolutions. I love to hear what you're intending for this year. So with that being said, thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you soon again, and yeah, bye!